I spent weekends during graduate school driving for Uber, sitting in my car waiting for the next ride, while the people I picked up were out spending money enjoying theirs. I had no idea at the time that any of it would matter. Looking back, some of the hardest, most directionless periods of my life turned out to be the foundation for things I couldn't have possibly seen coming. I've talked before about how I created my own luck, but I've come to realize that creating your own luck isn't always about knowing what you're doing. Sometimes it's simply about continuing to move when you have no idea where the path is going to lead. I'd always been a good student through high school, at least. Good grades, good schools, the quiet assumption that if I worked hard and did well academically, things would work out. My parents protected me from low-skill jobs when I was younger. They wanted me to focus on my studies. That assumption cracked once already before graduate school. For the first 3 years of college, I didn't study hard, and my grades slipped. Not because of bad luck or bad circumstances, just because I wasn't putting in the work. I made up for it later, mostly by grinding out a strong GRE score to get into grad school. But the gap in my record never fully disappeared, and neither did the quiet doubt it left behind. By the time I got to grad school, being a good student wasn't something I could take for granted about myself anymore. I just hadn't fully learned that yet. Grad school made it unavoidable. My research seemed to be going nowhere. I was slowly going through my savings, so I started driving for Uber to make ends meet. I wasn't embarrassed to be driving Uber. I was grateful that I had a way to make money. But there was something about the experience that was difficult. I would spend weekends driving around, shuttling people who were out enjoying themselves. Sometimes I would be sitting there waiting for the next ride, with no idea when it would come. My riders were enjoying their weekend while I sat waiting for the next ride. They were spending money while I was trying to make enough to keep from spending down my savings. The hardest part wasn't the work itself. It was the feeling that I had very little control over where my life was going. My research wasn't producing what I wanted. My savings were shrinking. And I started wondering whether this was going to be my life. Maybe I wasn't actually as smart as I had thought. Maybe I wasn't going to produce anything of intellectual consequence. Maybe I would eventually have to admit that I had failed to build a career for myself and remain financially dependent on my parents. These thoughts were uncomfortable because so much of my identity had been built around being a good student. I may be able to shrug off one bad stretch in college as a lapse. It was much harder to shrug off years of research that wasn't going anywhere. But eventually, I finished the research. My program was supposed to take 2 years. It ended up taking a bit longer than that. I had to pivot after my graduation ceremony, and it was another 4 months before everything was actually finished and the degree became official. Then something happened that didn't fit the story I was telling myself. I had planned to move back to Korea and do my military service. I had applied to several full-time engineering positions without much expectation of landing any of them. I assumed my college coursework wasn't strong enough and that my graduate work was at a much lower ranked school. I thought the job market would look at my resume and come to roughly the same conclusion I had come to about myself. But one of them came through. And when I joined the company, I learned something else. I saw people from schools that weren't particularly prestigious, people whose college coursework wasn't especially strong, people who had majored in different fields, and they were doing good work and being genuinely capable engineers. It took me a while to see that this was the same lesson wearing a different disguise. I had assumed that the credentials I had accumulated, or failed to accumulate, were much more predictive of my future than they actually were. They weren't. What mattered much more was what I could actually do. When I look back now, I can see that many of the things that eventually helped me weren't things I would have chosen at the time. Working a part-time job during a year off from college qualified me for in-state tuition, which cut the cost by more than 70%. That mattered because my parents had told me grad school was mine to pay for. Combined with engineering internships my advisor introduced me to, the discount was enough to fund my degree. None of the other jobs I worked along the way were chosen with any of this in mind either. I was a customer sales rep at a fried chicken restaurant. I developed curriculum and taught SAT and AP exam prep. As a master's student, I graded undergraduate coursework. I interned as an engineer. I drove for Uber, and specifically, that one taught me that dealing with people all day is harder than it looks, and that there's a dignity to it I hadn't given enough credit to before. At the time, each of those jobs was just a way to make money. Looking back, they taught me things no resume line would capture. Respect for people regardless of what they do for a living, the value of honest work regardless of its nature, and the confidence that whatever hardship came, I could take care of myself. I had spent much of my life on an academic pedestal. Good student, good grades, no menial jobs. I did not realize how narrow that perspective was until I stepped outside of it. When I raise my own children, I want them to work an ordinary job at some point too. Not because the job itself is valuable, but because there's a kind of confidence that comes from realizing you can take care of yourself. One that grades never quite teach you. Comedian Jimmy Carr once said, "You cannot have an easy life and a great character." I don't think that means we should go looking for hardship, but I do think there's something valuable about going through a period that isn't easy and discovering you can keep going anyway. Because you usually don't know yet what that period is going to become. At the time, coasting through the first 3 years of college felt like a lapse I was embarrassed about. My graduate research felt like a dead end. The odd jobs along the way felt like nothing more than ways to make ends meet. And applying to full-time engineering positions felt like a long shot. None of these things looked like pieces of a larger plan. But years later, they became part of the path. I've talked before about creating my own luck, and I still believe in that. But I think there's another part to it. Sometimes you create your own luck simply by continuing to put yourself in situations where something good can happen. You apply for the job even though you don't think you'll get it. You keep working on the research even though you're not sure where it's gonna go. You take the part-time job. You drive the Uber. You keep learning. You keep moving. You don't necessarily need to know how everything will pay off. You just need to avoid making the mistake of assuming that your current circumstances are a reliable prediction of your future. When you're in the middle of a difficult period, it can feel permanent. It can feel like evidence that you've made the wrong choices. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just a chapter whose value you will not understand until much later. I don't believe that everything happens for a reason. I think some things are simply difficult, disappointing, or unfair. But I do believe that almost any experience can leave something useful behind if you keep moving through it. Perspective, resilience, skills, relationships, self-reliance, or simply the confidence that you have survived uncertainty before. You can't always see what those things will compound into. That's why when life feels unclear, I try to remember. You do not have to know exactly where you're going. Just keep moving. All of it may help in the end.